Hello and welcome back to the Contemplation Cafe, broadcasting to you live from the Room of Requirement. And as always, we're inviting you to come inside, pull up a chair, and have a think or two. Today, we're going to look at a somewhat mystical and controversial, maybe kind of, definitely confusing, a topic called the Day of the Lord. And I really feel that with end time events being the way they are and the way they play out, we need to understand what the Day of the Lord is, kind of when the Day of the Lord occurs and what it means, kind of help us make a sense of the end time things. And if you've been watching the news lately, it's just looking more and more like the first seal is about to get, I don't know what you want to call it, unwrapped or broken or whatever. In the olden days, you'd break the seal because it was made of wax. So we'll say broken seal. We're on the verge now. Like with World War One, we know there was a defining event. So there was a political assassination that had occurred, and that pretty much set off all of Europe into World War One. And I don't know if we'll be able to watch something on TV and say, "Oh, that's the first seal." Don't know. But nonetheless, I think we're really ramping up to something here between Russia and Ukraine, and China wanting to take on Taiwan, and some of these other things over there, the border unrest between Poland and Belarus, and just all these things. It really just appears that we've got a real powder keg cooking here, and it just takes one little spark to set the whole thing off, and then we're going to start seeing those wars and rumors of wars, and we're going to see just combat all over the place. It won't just be confined. Will it be like World War III? Maybe, maybe not, but certainly there'll be lots of wars, lots of unrest, lots of upset. And then, of course, right behind that, you've got those other seals of famine and pestilence and death and economic scarcity and on and on. I'm going to talk about that later. I think one of the crucial things to look at is a thing called the Day of the Lord. And that's going to really help us understand where we are in these end time events. So we're just going to go at it. And we're going to just, as an introductory, 2 Timothy 1:12, and where Paul is talking to Timothy, says, "For I know whom I believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep what I have committed to him until that day." That day. That day is referred to as the Day of the Lord. It's also called that day or the Lord's Day. What's interesting to note, it's not a physical 24-hour day. It's a short period of time in which God's doing something. Think of it as God's way of saying, you've had your turn, now it's my turn. And here we go. Now, one thing to remember as well, Bible prophecy can have either a one-time or a multi-time fulfillment. So an example of a multiple fulfillment is the Emmanuel prophecy found in Isaiah 7:14. The immediate fulfillment was a sign from God to King Ahaz that Assyria would come help fight against the armies of Israel and Syria. The latter fulfillment was found in the birth of Christ. So the Day of the Lord, and I'm probably just going to shorten it down to TDOL. If you like acronyms or military, I'm just going to call it TDOL because the Day of the Lord is a lot and it's early. But the Day of the Lord also has a multiple fulfillment prophecy. So we were going to kind of run through the Bible and look for these places where we talk about the Day of the Lord. So we will shoot back to the Old Testament. Not quite the Day of the Lord, but it kind of fits the Day of the Lord. So you have the flood in Genesis 7. Up until then, the earth had become totally corrupt, and God said, man, I'm just going to wipe it out and start over again. He saves 8 people, wipes out everything else and starts over. And certainly Lot's escape from Sodom and Gomorrah in Genesis 19. Lot and his family get out, and then God sends down fire and destruction and wipes out those cities. So God had enough. And in both instances, he delivered the righteous and sent judgment on the unrighteous at the same time. At the same time, you see this in Luke 17. So Jesus is talking about both of those events, and he mentioned that everybody was eating and drinking and marrying and giving in marriage, basically just saying it was all business as usual. People were just doing their thing. Once God's people had been saved or delivered or rescued, whatever you want to call it, right at the same time they're saved, God's judgment came down. And this is really the context that we're going to look at the day of the Lord in as far as the rapture goes. But we'll get there in a second. Let's keep going through the Old Testament so we kind of get an idea of what these various Day of the Lord episodes look like. So in Isaiah chapter 2, verses 5 through 22 makes a reference of the day of the Lord. In this case, Judah and Jerusalem had their turn at doing things, and they fell into continued and unrepentant idolatry, which was a continual theme in the Old Testament, unfortunately. God's turn involved judgment. There are 2 or 3 other possible fulfillments, maybe, between the breaking of the 6th and the 7th seals, and immediately prior to the blowing of the first trumpet in Revelation 7 and 8. The Battle of Armageddon in Revelation 19, 11 through 21 could be. The final battle between the Lord and Satan in Revelation 27 through 10. That could also be one. Isaiah 13. Babylon had its turn at doing things and failed to acknowledge the Lord as the source of all its glory, prosperity, and success. Now it's God's turn in verse 9. God is going to judge Babylon, and he's going to use the Medes and the Persians, or Medo-Persia, or however you want to look at it, to do it. Now note the language in verse 10. Doesn't that remind you of Joel 2, Matthew 24, and Revelation 6? Is it possible that this day of the Lord will be visited on the Babylon of Revelation 18 through 20? Now, looking ahead, we see references to this end-time Babylon. Now, I certainly don't believe that it is a physical city, because the city of Babylon, as it stands now in modern-day Iraq, is still just a bunch of ruins. There is no city. And with all the time left, I can't imagine that you're just going to raise up this super city to be the center of all of this world commerce and world government and world everything else. Just don't think that's possible. So really Babylon there is referring to something else. And of course, God will judge that Babylon. Babylon the Great is fallen. Now, in Jeremiah 46, for example, Egypt had its turn at doing things, and God used Egypt to bring a measure of judgment against Judah. However, Egypt managed to run afoul of the Lord's anger, and now it's God's turn, and that's in verse number 10. He's going to use Babylon to execute judgment on Egypt. And this particular day of the Lord appears to be confined to that moment in history. Ezekiel 13. Judah is full of false prophets and practitioners of witchcraft. They've had their turn at deceiving God's people, and now it's God's turn in verse number 5. Judgment is coming. Ezekiel 30, another proclamation of bad things about to happen to Egypt and her allies. And of course in verse 3 specifically, the day of the Lord is mentioned there. And that one appears to be confined to that moment as well. Joel 1, 2, and 3, the day of the Lord is all over the place. Chapters 1 and 2 deal with judgment on Judah. Chapter 3 deals with judgment on the nations. And notice the imagery we talk about in verses 28 to 32 and chapter 3, verse 15. It looks just like the language that Jesus uses in Matthew 24 regarding the events preceding his return and the rapture of the church. The same language is used in Revelation 6 when the 6th seal is broken. In Acts 2, Peter preached the outpouring of the Holy Spirit at Pentecost was a direct fulfillment of Joel 2, 28 to 32. So I have a feeling we'll be seeing that one again soon. And notice, in the day of Pentecost, we didn't have the sun darkened, the moon darkened, and stars falling from the sky, but yet Peter says that what occurred then was a fulfillment of what Joel was talking about. So I do think we're going to see a future one of these where we are going to see the sun darken, the moon darken, the stars fall, just like Jesus said, just like we have it there at the 6th seal in the book of Revelation. This is that. That's the final fulfillment. We're going to see it. Amos chapter 5, again, verse 18. God is going to bring judgment on Israel and or Judah for their continued idolatry. That's just a one-time event. Obadiah appears in verse 15. Edom, or the descendants of Esau, had long been bitter enemies of Israel. The Edomites were so happy to see the Babylonians attacking Judah, they joined in to help plunder their enemies. As a result, the Edomites were eradicated from the face of the earth. Again, a one-time event. Zephaniah 1. The day of the Lord appears in verse 7. God's going to judge Judah and Jerusalem for their idolatry. Again, probably a one-time event. Zechariah 14. Whole chapters devoted to God's judgment on the nations and the eventual establishment of his kingdom rule on earth. Definitely a future day of the Lord occurrence. Verses 12 and 13 have imagery consistent with the effects of an atomic or a nuclear weapon. Think about that one, especially now that we have some other nations out there that have launched hypersonic space weapons. So now they can rain down nuclear weapons from outer space. Hard to detect, hard to defend. This day the Lord might be seen 2 or 3 times in Revelation 18 through 22. Malachi chapter 4, that day of the Lord refers to the arrival and earthly ministry of Jesus. John the Baptist was the Elijah mentioned in verse 5, may also refer to other events in Revelation. So, for example, John the Baptist was the Elijah who is to come then, and we may see that the translated Elijah is one of the 2 witnesses that come later on. We'll see. All right, so now, while the Old Testament examples may deal with more than one fulfillment, the New Testament deals primarily with the time period there in Revelation where that 6th seal is broken, the trumpet and bowl judgments are poured out, and then the millennial reign of Christ is inaugurated. So now what we're going to do. I've already talked about this before, but we're going to run through it again. We have this 7-year period of time called Daniel's 70th week of years. So the pre-tribulation people believe that the rapture occurs at the beginning, before all the bad stuff happens, and we're out of here. We're enjoying our cold beverages and crunchy, salty snacks from the bleachers and watching everything else poured out. There's another group, they're the mid-tribulation people, that basically we go halfway through mid-tribulation, and then we get out of here. There is a post-tribulation view that says the church is going through the whole thing, and then there's some kind of rapture after that, and somehow it's like a quick rapture. We kind of go up, come back, and then Christ establishes his kingdom. There's another view, which is the one that I personally hold, called the pre-wrath rapture view, that basically the church will go out sometime between the midpoint and the end, or somewhere in there, don't know exactly when. If you go back and look at, we may do this later, the seals, the judgment, or the trumpets, and the bowl judgment. So we have the seals, those aren't God's judgments. Okay, go back and look at them again. It's just war, it's famine, it's disease, it's death, economic scarcity, it's martyrdom of Christians, it's all of these things. This is just the wrath of man and the wrath of Satan. This is not God's judgment on anything. These are just seals. After the 6th seal is broken, we see what the sun darken, moon darken, stars fall from the sky. The sign of the Son of Man is seen coming in the clouds of glory. There's the trumpet sound, the voice of the archangel. Angels are scattered throughout the world to get the elect out of the earth, because after that, it's the trumpet judgments, and those are judgments, and the bowls of wrath, which are also judgments. And God promised that we were not appointed to wrath, that we have been delivered from that. We've passed from death to life, and God's wrath and judgments have passed over us. So we won't be here for that. But certainly the 6 seals, we're here for that. So again, that will be some point after the midpoint, because I certainly believe that the midpoint, obviously Antichrist breaks his peace treaty. He declares himself to be God, demands to be worshipped as God, tells people they're taking the mark, and if they don't, they're going to die. So it's somewhere between there and the end that the church goes out. Again, that's also why Christ had mentioned that if those days were not cut short, and they were cut short for whose sake? The elect's sake. If the elect aren't here, why does it matter? It wouldn't. Who cares? He's cut those days short for the elect's sake. Otherwise, no flesh would be saved. Think about that. All right, back into it. Now, we can look at things along the way, and I'm just going to touch on these real fast. This will be your reading assignment. Again, look at Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 17, Luke 21, Acts 2, 2 Timothy 1, 1 Thessalonians 4 and 5, 2 Thessalonians 1 and 2, 2 Peter 3, Revelation 6, and Revelation 18 through 22. That it's all there. So we will go back and kind of touch on these briefly. Just didn't want to waste all the time reading them myself. But you can go read those on your own. And Matthew 24, Mark, and Luke, Jesus speaks on three topics: when the temple gets destroyed, when he comes again, and when the end of the age is. So in verses 5 through 14, there's a painting of rather unpleasant future events: false messiahs and prophets, wars, famine, pestilence or disease, earthquakes. That's just the beginning. After these things, the saints will face some pretty fierce persecution. The gospel gets preached around the world as a witness, and the end comes. I really believe that verse 15 in there has three fulfillments. The first, Antiochus Epiphanes desecrates the temple in 168 BC. He sets up an idol to Zeus, sacrifices a pig on the altar. Second fulfillment, 70 AD, when the temple was destroyed by the Romans. Third fulfillment, around the middle of that 70th week, because Antichrist declares himself to be God and sets up that image that somehow comes to life and begins to speak and whatnot. That image is going to be set up right there in the temple. So again, this last temple that's yet to be built, which I think is going to get built sometime very, very soon, is going to be desecrated and defiled one last time. All right, so now look at verse 29. Immediately after this time of suffering, the sun gets darkened, the moon gets darkened, the stars diminished. Sign of the Son of Man will be seen in the sky. Jesus will send his angels out to gather the elect from the four corners of the globe. That is called the rapture. Again, in 1 Thessalonians 4, Paul talks about two things: the rapture of the church and the day of the Lord. So if you read chapter 4, go right into chapter 5, it really looks like we have two things going on at the same time. So it's not the same thing. They're concurrent. Saints go up, God's wrath comes down, just like Jesus talked about Noah and Lot. They got to safety, God's wrath came down on the same day. Not the same time, but one right after the other. God takes care of his people, God takes care of the wicked. 2 Thessalonians 1:10, when he comes in that day, and that refers to the day of the Lord. Now, it's a happy day for us believers, right? God repays with tribulation those who have troubled us and gives us rest when Jesus is revealed from heaven with his mighty angels and taking vengeance on unbelievers. So it's going to be a great day. The rapture is going to be just an awesome time. We're going to be shouting the name of King Jesus and praising the Lord. At the meantime, we're going to be so happy. It's like, oh, finally, justice is served. God's going after the wicked. It's going to be awesome. And again, 2 Thessalonians 2, look at the rapture again. The rapture in verse 1, day of the Lord, verse 3, will not happen until there are two things that have to occur. Number one, the great falling away, and Antichrist is revealed. Notice they're mentioned together. So why would people fall away from the church? Going to have to go back to the parable of the sower. Because if we don't understand that one, the rest of the parables don't make any sense, right? Remember, we've got seed sown by the road. Those are just hardcore non-believers. Just no matter what you say to them, just nope, 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 not for today, no time, nope, 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 nope. The other two, these are church people. Now, these people are not saved. They're not born again. They're just church people. Remember, standing in a church makes you no more a Christian than standing in a car or standing in a garage makes you an automobile. It's early. Same thing. These people are in the church. They participate in church activities. They go to Sunday school. They sing in the choir. They do whatever. But when Antichrist shows up and he says that, take the mark or you die, these people are going to disappear. When the tribulation comes, when the heat comes, they disappear. They fall away. They're falling away. That's why we have the great apostasy. It's not the elect who are going to fall away, because we're secure. That's why we have this doctrine of eternal security. We'll talk about it another day. But the elect are secure. We're not going anywhere. We're not going to fall away. We will endure to the end. Remember, Jesus said that. He that endures to the end shall be saved. Not that he who goes part way and quits. These people who were on stony ground and people who were on thorny ground, these are folks who do not endure to the end. They go part way, and then when the going gets tough, they quit. They wilt and they fall away. The thorns come in and choke everything out. They're unfruitful. And the Bible tells us again, any branch in Christ that doesn't bear fruit gets cut off and thrown into the fire. Yikes. Make sure that's not you. All right. Back into 2 Peter in 3 verses 10 through 13. This is probably the very last day of the Lord, because God will burn everything up with fire, purging every trace of sin and unrighteousness from the universe. He then makes a new heaven and a new earth in which righteousness dwells. And you can check that in Isaiah 65, 66, and Revelation 21. All right, so here we go into Revelation 6. We have the breaking of all 7 seals. The events that follow, again, not the wrath of God, but rather the wrath of man and the devil. Seals 1 through 4, the wars, the rumors of wars, kingdom against kingdom, nation against nation, and their consequences: famine, pestilence, death, scarcity, economic upheaval. I really think what we've seen recently in the past couple of years, and right now, is a demonic dress rehearsal. Think about it. So we have this little organism that appears on the world scene. How it got there, we're just going to leave that to the side. But it's here. And what has it done all by itself? All by itself. In response to this organism that can't be seen with the naked eye, we've already had economic upset. We've had some scarcity of things. Remember, toilet paper and paper towels disappeared for a while. But the funny part was, you can walk in the store and all that super expensive imported oil, the shelves were full of that, and the wine aisle was full of wine. Never were those 2 aisles empty. Never, never, never. Interesting. We have seen, obviously, death came out of that. Hundreds of thousands of people have lost their lives because of this thing. We've seen governments of all kinds begin to assert all kinds of control over people. Do this, do that, do this, do that. Just yesterday, the mayor of New York City has told people, basically, if you don't take a certain medicinal remedy, you're cut off from everything indoors in our city. Everything. That's no gym, no grocery store, no movie theater, no restaurant, no drive-in, zero. You can only do things outside in the open air. That's it. Australia has done some of the same things. Now we're seeing these crazy things happening in Europe. It sounds an awful lot like the mark of the beast, right? Take the mark or suffer the consequences. This is just a demonic dress rehearsal. This is getting all the pieces put into place, conditioning human behavior, because we need to be conditioned for behaviors. That's how that works. This is a trial run. This is a dry run. This is a, let's get people ready, because if we get to a point where we start complying with this stuff now, how much easier will it be to comply with the mark of the beast later? It's exactly the same. If you don't take the mark, you can't buy or sell, can't go to the doctor, can't do this, can't do that, can't do anything, and we're going to kill you. So there you go. All right. Seal number 5 is the crying of the martyrs for God to pour out his wrath and judgment on the earth and the wicked, because, again, they're being hunted down. They're told to be patient, because you got to wait till they're all done. Seal number 6, Day of the Lord. Look at verses 16 and 17. It's the same phenomena as in Matthew 24 and in Joel chapter 2, Acts chapter 2. After the sealing of Israel in chapter 7, which don't understand what that is, we haven't seen that yet. We also have an image of a great multitude coming out of the Great Tribulation. That will be believers coming out of the Great Tribulation. Coming out because we have been raptured, been taken out. And then the trumpet judgments and bowl judgments, which are the wrath of God, start after we've been raptured out. And again, in Revelation 19 through 22, God begins to wind everything up. Jesus drops in, destroys the armies of Antichrist. Antichrist and the false prophet get tossed in the lake of fire. This would count as a day of the Lord, because God steps in and does something. It's like, okay, you've had your turn, now it's my turn. After the millennial reign of Christ, Satan gets loose and foolishly attempts to raise another army to wipe Jesus out. God sends fire down from above and roasts them all to a crisp. Satan gets tossed into the lake of fire as well. This certainly should count as a day of the Lord, even though it doesn't call it that. And then God, of course, makes a new heaven and earth, and we all live happily ever after. Amen. So just a word of comfort. All these things that we see, understand that God has been and will continue to be active in the affairs of men and nations until the very end. And we can take comfort in knowing that from this point forward, when we see the day of the Lord happens, whenever it happens, because the wrath of God has passed over us, because we've passed from death to life, it'll be nothing but good to those who love God and who are the called according to his purpose. That's good news. With that being said, thanks for stopping by the Contemplation Cafe. Have a good rest of your day.